Mrs. Beatrice was a quiet and dignified woman in her late 70s, with a long history of shopping at her local grocery store every week. It was a routine she enjoyed, one that had become second nature over the years. She would take her time, carefully choosing the freshest fruits and vegetables, reminiscing about the days when her children were young. And she'd load up the cart with everything they needed for the week. Her pace was slow, as her joints ached from the wear and tear of age, but she didn't mind. It was a peaceful moment for her, away from the stresses of the world. She smiled at familiar faces in the aisles, exchanging a polite good morning with anyone she met. On this particular morning, the store was busier than usual. The shelves were well stocked, and the hum of chatter from fellow shoppers filled the air. Beatrice didn't mind, it was just part of the bustle. As she wheeled her cart toward the dairy section, she noticed two police officers entering the store. She thought nothing of it, as the store had always had a good relationship with the local police. They were often in and out, sometimes chatting with the staff, sometimes doing their shopping just like everyone else. But today, something felt different. The officers, both men, were dressed in their usual uniforms, dark blue, with badges gleaming on their chests. Beatrice could feel their eyes following her as she moved along the aisles. At first, she assumed it was just her imagination, but the feeling didn't go away. It became more pronounced, like a weight pressing on her chest. Her movements slowed a little, and her hand tightened around the handle of her cart. She tried to focus on her shopping, but she couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. It wasn't long before one of the officers made his way toward her. He was tall, with a serious look on his face, and his partner followed closely behind. As they neared her, Beatrice's heart started to race. They stopped in front of her cart, blocking her way. The taller officer gave her a long, hard stare. "Excuse me, Mom," the officer said, his tone sharper than usual. "Can I see your receipt?" Beatrice blinked in confusion, not understanding what was happening. "My receipt?" she asked softly. "I'm just shopping, officer. I haven't even checked out yet." But the officer didn't seem to care. His partner, who had been standing off to the side, stepped closer, his arms folded across his chest. "We've had reports of shoplifting," he said, his voice cold. "We're just making sure everything's in order." Beatrice, startled by the sudden attention, reached into her purse to retrieve her wallet and show the officer her shopping list. She didn't know what was going on, but she certainly wasn't about to let this go unnoticed. She didn't steal. She never had. The officer's eyes scanned her cart, and it was clear that they were sizing her up, making her feel smaller and smaller with every passing second. They didn't trust her. "I'm not stealing anything," Beatrice said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm just buying what I need for the week. I have nothing to hide." But the officers remained unmoved. The one who had spoken before now raised his voice, his words harsh. "You don't need to get defensive, ma'am. We're just doing our job." Beatrice felt a lump rise in her throat. She hadn't done anything wrong, but it seemed like nothing she said would convince them. She was just an elderly woman, trying to shop in peace, and yet here she was, caught in an uncomfortable and unfounded situation. As the officers continued to question her, the other customers in the store began to notice the scene. Whispers began to spread through the aisles, and a sense of unease settled over the once friendly atmosphere. But no one spoke up. No one moved. It was then that Mrs. Beatrice realized this was not just an ordinary moment. This wasn't just about a misunderstanding. It was something deeper, and she wasn't sure how it would all unfold. The embarrassment she felt was palpable, and the feeling of being unfairly singled out began to consume her, leaving her wondering how far the situation would go. The confrontation between Beatrice and the two officers continued to escalate. At first, she had tried to stay calm, to explain that she was simply there to shop, but now she could feel the tension thickening in the air. The taller officer, still blocking her cart, was no longer just asking questions. His tone had grown colder, more authoritative. He seemed to be looking for a reason to accuse her, no matter what she said. "I told you, I haven't even checked out yet." Beatrice repeated, trying to keep her voice steady, but her hands were shaking. She didn't know what had made these officers so suspicious of her. Her mind raced as she tried to think of any possible reason, but nothing came to her. She had been a law-abiding citizen her whole life, had always paid for her groceries, and had never once caused trouble in this store. But now, here she was, being treated like a criminal. The officer, not satisfied with her response, moved closer, his presence overwhelming. Beatrice could feel his eyes on her, sharp and judging. "We need to see your receipt, ma'am." "It's standard procedure," he said, his voice tight with impatience. The other officer, standing just behind him, crossed his arms and eyed her suspiciously, as if waiting for her to slip up. Beatrice's heart pounded in her chest, and for a moment she felt like she might faint. The store, once a place of comfort and routine, now felt like a cold, unforgiving space. The fluorescent lights above her seemed to buzz louder, and the hum of the other customers around her faded into the background. She was alone, despite the people nearby, and the only thing that mattered in that moment was the judgment coming from the officers. She reached for her purse, her hands feeling clammy as she fumbled to retrieve her receipt. As she handed it to the officer, her mind kept swirling with confusion and hurt. Why was this happening? She had no idea. Was it because of her age? Was it because of the color of her skin? It was a thought that she had tried to ignore for so long, but now it felt impossible to dismiss. The officers didn't seem to be looking for the truth. They were looking for a reason to take action. The taller officer took the receipt and inspected it closely, as if searching for something wrong, but Beatrice couldn't see anything that could possibly raise a red flag. She was just a woman buying her groceries, doing nothing more than any other person in the store. Yet here she was, standing in front of two uniformed men who seemed determined to make her feel like a criminal. "Everything looks fine," the officer said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But you still need to come with us." He motioned for her to follow him toward the back of the store, his partner stepping in line beside her, like an impenetrable wall. Beatrice froze, her heart racing. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She felt an overwhelming wave of exhaustion wash over her, both mentally and physically. She hadn't done anything wrong, and yet she was being treated like someone who had. The feeling of helplessness began to settle in her chest like a stone, heavy and suffocating. Around her, the other shoppers began to notice what was happening. Their eyes flicked toward Beatrice, and then away quickly, like they didn't want to get involved. Some looked uncomfortable, others seemed oblivious to the injustice unfolding right in front of them. It was as if she was invisible, surrounded by people who could have spoken up but chose not to. Beatrice felt the sting of isolation, and for a brief moment, she wondered if anyone would come to her aid. Would anyone say something? Would anyone stand up for her? But no one did. And so Beatrice stood there, powerless, as the two officers insisted she follow them to the back, unaware that this moment, this injustice, would soon spark a much bigger chain of events. As the officers continued to guide Beatrice toward the back of the store, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Her thoughts raced, and a sense of dread hung in the air. She was an elderly woman, frail and vulnerable, and yet here she was, being treated like a criminal in front of everyone. She felt the weight of the situation bearing down on her shoulders, each step feeling heavier than the last. The officers moved with purpose, as if they had already decided her fate, and Beatrice's heart raced with each passing moment. But there was someone else watching the scene unfold, and her name was Maya. She was a young woman, probably in her mid-20s, who had been shopping for a few items when she first noticed the commotion. At first, she didn't think much of it. After all, the police were often around, especially in busy areas like this. But when she saw the two officers approach Beatrice, a sharp feeling of unease crept into her chest. Something didn't feel right. She could see the elderly woman's discomfort, her slight hesitation, as she tried to understand why she was being singled out. Maya's gut told her this wasn't just a simple misunderstanding. Maya kept her eyes on the scene, her curiosity piqued. She watched the officers' every move, noting their aggressive stance and the way they were making Beatrice feel small and insignificant. It was obvious that the elderly woman was uncomfortable, but the officers didn't seem to care. Maya couldn't just stand by and watch anymore. She had to do something. Without making a sound, she pulled out her phone from her purse, her hand steady despite the rising tension in her chest. Maya quickly turned the camera on, aiming it at the interaction unfolding in front of her. She knew that the truth had to be captured. This couldn't be allowed to happen without anyone noticing. The camera clicked on silently, recording every word, every movement. Maya's eyes stayed focused on the screen as she recorded, her heart pounding as she watched the officer's actions. She felt the injustice in the air, and the urge to speak up grew stronger with each passing second. But she hesitated. What if she made things worse? What if getting involved only escalated the situation? But Maya knew that doing nothing was not an option. She had to bear witness to this, and she had to make sure others could see it too. She kept a low profile, trying to stay out of sight, while making sure the officer's words were captured clearly. As she zoomed in on the interaction, she could hear the officer's voice grow colder. "Just come with us," he said again, his words sharp and firm. "We'll sort this out in the back." Maya watched, her breath catching as the scene unfolded, and Beatrice, though visibly shaken, didn't protest. She was confused and frightened, but she followed them, knowing that arguing wouldn't help. The moment stretched on, and Maya could feel the tension in the air. The store, once a place of routine and calm, now felt oppressive and heavy with the weight of the injustice that was being allowed to happen. As the officers guided Beatrice through the aisles, Maya couldn't help but feel a deep sense of empathy for the woman. She imagined how difficult it must have been for Beatrice to feel so small, so helpless, surrounded by people who didn't stand up. Maya couldn't change what had happened in the past few moments, but she could make sure that the world saw what was going on. The video in her phone was her only weapon, and she would use it to make sure that Beatrice's story wasn't forgotten. The officers continued their harsh treatment, oblivious to the fact that Maya was recording every moment. They seemed to believe that their power and authority gave them the right to control the situation, but they didn't realize that the truth was about to be made public. Maya had no idea just how much impact the video would have, but as she filmed, she couldn't help but feel a sense of determination. She was doing the right thing. Beatrice deserved better. And soon, the whole world would know what had happened. Maya stood frozen for a moment, watching as the two officers continued to push Beatrice toward the back of the store. The sight was unbearable, and she felt an overwhelming urge to do something. Anything to stop what was happening. But she knew she had to be careful. She couldn't just walk up and interrupt the officers, not without making things worse. So instead, she focused on the phone in her hand. The camera was rolling, capturing everything. As she watched, Maya's mind raced. This wasn't just an ordinary confrontation. It was something bigger, something that spoke to deeper issues in society. The way the officers treated Beatrice, the way they seemed to assume she was guilty just because of her age and appearance, made Maya's stomach churn. But at least, she thought, she could do something that mattered. The video on her phone would be proof. It would show the world exactly what was happening. Maya took a deep breath and steadied her hand, ensuring the video was steady. Her heart was pounding in her chest. She could feel her palms sweating. She knew that the moment she posted the video, everything would change. The world would see the truth. But what would happen after that? Would people listen? Would this injustice be swept under the rug, or would something finally be done about it? As Beatrice and the officers reached the back of the store, the moment of quiet tension in the aisle seemed to stretch on forever. Maya continued to record, silently hoping someone would step forward, speak up, do something. She could feel her throat tighten as the officers' voices grew louder in the background. They were continuing to interrogate Beatrice, pushing her to explain herself, even though she had done nothing wrong. Maya's finger hovered over the button to upload the video. She hesitated, but only for a second. She knew what she had to do. She tapped the button, and within moments, the video was online, shared to social media platforms, and instantly began to gain attention. Maya watched as the view count began to climb, and comments started rolling in. People were reacting in real time, some expressing their disbelief, others offering support for Beatrice. The video didn't just stop there. It spread like wildfire. Within hours, it was being shared across social media, picked up by news outlets, and viewed by thousands of people. The raw emotion in Beatrice's face, her helplessness, and the aggressive way the officers were treating her were clear in every frame. It was undeniable, and people couldn't look away. Maya felt a small sense of relief, knowing that she had captured the truth, but she couldn't shake the weight of the situation. Beatrice was still in the store, still facing the officers. Would they stop now that the world was watching? Maya refreshed the page on her phone over and over, watching as the video gained traction. The outpouring of support was incredible. Strangers from all over were commenting, calling for justice. Some even made direct calls for the officers to be held accountable for their actions. The video had sparked something much bigger than Maya had ever imagined. It wasn't just about Beatrice anymore. It was about what was right, about standing up for fairness, for decency. As Maya watched the video go viral, a thought crossed her mind. She realized this moment, this act of bravery in capturing the truth, had the potential to change everything. People were seeing the reality of what had happened, and they weren't going to let it slide. Maya knew that, while Beatrice was still facing the officers, the momentum of what had just happened couldn't be stopped. The world was watching, and that was a power no one could ignore. In the back of the store, the officers were still unaware of the impact their actions were about to have. They were focused solely on their mission to make Beatrice feel small, but the world outside was already reacting to the injustice they had caused. What happened next would change everything for Beatrice and for everyone who had ever been mistreated in silence. As the video continued to spread across social media, the reactions grew louder. People from all over the world were watching, sharing, and commenting on what had happened to Mrs. Beatrice. The shock of seeing an elderly woman treated so poorly by the officers stirred something in everyone who saw it. Many were outraged, others were heartbroken, but most were determined to make sure that Beatrice wasn't left to face this alone. The power of the internet, combined with the collective voices of thousands of people, began to take shape into something bigger than anyone could have anticipated. News outlets, local and national, began to pick up the story. What had started as a single powerful video posted by Maya quickly became headline news. Journalists reached out to Beatrice, wanting to interview her and get her side of the story. In the days following the incident, the grocery store where it all took place found itself surrounded by protesters, activists, and concerned citizens. People were standing in solidarity, demanding justice and accountability for what had happened. The message was clear. No one would tolerate this kind of treatment, no matter who it was happening to. Beatrice, though overwhelmed by all the attention, couldn't help but feel a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. She had never imagined that something like this could happen to her. She had lived a quiet, peaceful life. And now she was at the center of a movement. The support from the community poured in from every direction. People dropped off flowers at her doorstep, sent her letters of encouragement, and even made donation drives in her name. It was clear that the community was rallying around her, but Beatrice still found it hard to comprehend. How had it come to this? How had her simple trip to the store turned into something that would shake the very foundation of the community? Maya, too, couldn't believe how quickly things had changed. The video she had taken had gone viral, and she was suddenly being contacted by everyone, from journalists to community organizers. She had never expected that one simple act of recording an injustice could lead to something so impactful. Maya was a young woman, still figuring out her place in the world, and now she had become a key player in this larger story. She had done something that many people wouldn't have the courage to do. She had used her phone to capture the truth, and now the world was watching. In the days that followed, local leaders began to speak out, demanding an investigation into the officers' actions. The mayor of the city addressed the community, promising that the situation would be thoroughly examined. The police department, which had remained silent at first, now found itself under pressure. The public outcry was too loud to ignore, and it was clear that something needed to be done. Beatrice, surrounded by the support of her community, began to find strength in the voices of those who were standing with her. She had always been a quiet, reserved woman, but now she felt empowered. The injustice she had faced was no longer just her burden to bear. It was the burden of everyone who believed in fairness and equality. She knew that whatever happened next, she wasn't alone. As the protests continued to grow, more and more people joined in. Some brought signs that read, "Justice for Beatrice," while others simply stood quietly, showing their support. The grocery store, once a place of routine for Beatrice, had become the symbol of a larger fight for justice. The peaceful demonstrations were not just about the officers' actions that day. They were about sending a message that no one should be mistreated or belittled because of their age, race, or appearance. With every passing day, the voices of the people grew louder, and Beatrice began to feel a sense of hope she hadn't known in years. This was bigger than one incident. It was a movement. And she, the woman who had only gone to buy groceries, was now part of something much larger than herself. What had started as a cruel and unjust moment was now a call for change that couldn't be ignored. As the protests continued to grow and the support for Beatrice flooded in, the pressure on the local authorities became undeniable. The video of the incident had spread far beyond the community, reaching national headlines and sparking discussions about racial profiling, inequality, and police conduct. The mayor and city council, who had initially been slow to respond, now found themselves at the center of a public outcry. The truth was out there for everyone to see, and there was no way to hide from it. The police department, once confident in its actions, was now under intense scrutiny. The community demanded accountability. No longer could they ignore what had happened, and there was a growing sense of urgency to take action. The officers who had mistreated Beatrice were placed on administrative leave while an internal investigation was launched. It was a small step, but it was a step nonetheless. For Beatrice, the whole process felt surreal. She had never imagined that her quiet life would be turned upside down like this. She had just gone to the store to buy food, never expecting that something as simple as that could lead to such a profound and public reckoning. But now, the attention was on her, and she realized just how powerful the collective voice of the people could be. As the investigation into the officers' conduct moved forward, Beatrice was flooded with messages of support. People sent her letters, cards, and even small gifts. Strangers told her how much her story had inspired them to speak out against injustice in their own communities. Meanwhile, Maya, who had filmed the video, was starting to process just how much her simple decision to record had affected the course of events. She had never seen herself as a hero, but now, as the story gained more traction, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She had taken a stand, not by speaking out loudly, but by quietly capturing the truth with her phone. It was an action that had sparked something much bigger than she had ever imagined. Maya found herself speaking to reporters and community activists, explaining why she felt compelled to act. She shared how she had seen the injustice unfold and knew that if she didn't do something, the truth might never come to light. The response to her actions was overwhelming, and she realized just how many people were grateful that someone had taken that step. The investigation into the officers' actions progressed, and the public pressure continued to mount. It became clear that the officers involved in Beatrice's mistreatment had a history of complaints against them, many of which had been ignored or dismissed. This revelation only added fuel to the fire. The community was no longer willing to accept the status quo. They wanted change, and they wanted it now. Beatrice, though still shaken by the events, began to feel a growing sense of empowerment. She had become a symbol of resilience, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever faced injustice. She had never expected to be in the spotlight, but now she felt a deep responsibility to stand up for what was right. She spoke with activists and community leaders, sharing her story and advocating for the changes she wanted to see. The power of her voice, combined with the growing movement around her, began to take on a life of its own. As the days passed, the news of the officer's suspension and the ongoing investigation made headlines. People continued to rally outside the police station and the grocery store, demanding that the officers be held accountable for their actions. The community had come together in a way that no one could have predicted, and Beatrice felt proud to be a part of it. She had always believed in the goodness of people, but now she was witnessing it firsthand. This was more than just a fight for justice. It was a fight for dignity, equality, and respect for everyone, no matter who they were. For Beatrice, this journey was far from over. She knew that the fight for justice didn't end with the suspension of 2 officers. It was a larger, ongoing struggle, one that would require constant effort and vigilance. But as she stood surrounded by the support of her community, she knew that they were all in this together. They had taken the first step, and they wouldn't stop until justice was fully served. As the days continued to unfold, the pressure on the police department to act was overwhelming. The video of Beatrice's mistreatment had spread far and wide, and the officers involved could no longer hide behind the badge. The public outcry was deafening, with thousands of people demanding justice. Activists, politicians, and ordinary citizens alike were all calling for accountability, and the movement that had started in a small grocery store had transformed into a wave of change. It wasn't just about what happened to Beatrice anymore. It had become about a larger fight against injustice, inequality, and the abuse of power. The investigation into the officers' actions was swift. As evidence mounted, it became clear that these officers had acted inappropriately, and their behavior toward Beatrice was not an isolated incident. The 2 officers had a history of complaints against them, many of which had been dismissed without further investigation. But this time, the community would not let it go unnoticed. The public's unwavering support for Beatrice made it impossible for the police department to turn a blind eye. Beatrice, although grateful for all the support, still felt a sense of disbelief at the situation. She had never imagined that a simple trip to the store could lead to such a whirlwind of events. But now, as the investigation began to unfold, she found herself at the center of a larger movement. Her voice, once silent in the face of adversity, was now being heard by the world, and while the process was long and sometimes overwhelming, she found strength in the support that surrounded her. Meanwhile, the 2 officers involved were placed on administrative leave. They were no longer patrolling the streets, but their future in law enforcement hung in the balance. The community's demand for justice didn't stop with their suspension. People wanted answers. They wanted to know why these officers had been allowed to act with such disregard for a woman who had done nothing wrong. And they wanted to know what would be done to ensure that something like this never happened again. The investigation continued, and it soon became clear that the officers had violated their professional code of conduct. The evidence showed that their treatment of Beatrice had been entirely unjustified, and their actions had crossed a line. The city's leaders, who had initially hesitated to take a firm stance, now found themselves compelled to act. Public pressure was too great, and the community's demand for accountability could not be ignored. As the investigation progressed, the officers were finally terminated from their positions. It was a moment of victory for Beatrice and everyone who had stood by her side. The officers, who had once wielded their power with such confidence, now faced the consequences of their actions. The termination was not just a result of their mistreatment of Beatrice. It was a result of the years of complaints and accusations that had been swept under the rug. The community had spoken, and they had demanded justice. For Beatrice, the news of the officer's termination brought a sense of relief. She had never wished for anyone to lose their job, but the sense of justice that came with their dismissal was undeniable. She felt that for the first time, the system had worked in her favor. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about making sure that no one else would have to experience what she had gone through. The victory wasn't just hers. It was a win for everyone who had ever been mistreated or silenced. But even as the officers were held accountable, Beatrice knew that the fight wasn't over. There was still work to be done, still changes to be made. The world had seen the injustice, but now it was up to all of them to make sure it didn't happen again. Beatrice became a strong advocate for reform, speaking out at rallies and sharing her story with lawmakers. She knew that the change she had sparked in her community could ripple out, reaching other cities and making a difference beyond her own. As she reflected on the journey, Beatrice felt a profound sense of pride. She had faced adversity with grace and strength, and she had helped to bring about a change that mattered. It had been a long road, but it was one that was worth every step. The support of her community, the determination of the activists, and the voices of those who had rallied behind her had made all the difference. Together, they had ensured that justice was served, and that the fight for equality and fairness would continue for generations to come. As the weeks passed, the echoes of Beatrice's story continued to resonate far beyond her small community. The termination of the officers involved was just the beginning, and the change that had started with a single act of courage was still unfolding. Beatrice had never imagined that a simple trip to the grocery store could spark such a powerful movement, but she was slowly beginning to understand the profound impact her experience had had on so many people. She was often approached by strangers who thanked her for speaking out and for standing up to the officers. People came to her with stories of their own struggles, their own moments of injustice, and they thanked her for showing them that they didn't have to remain silent. Beatrice never expected to become a symbol, but the more she heard from others, the more she realized that her story wasn't just hers alone. It was part of something bigger, something that everyone could relate to in their own way. It was about standing up for what was right, even when the odds seemed stacked against you. The movement that had begun with the video Maya had shared continued to grow. The grocery store where the incident took place became a focal point for discussions on justice, fairness, and equality. People from all walks of life came together to show their support for Beatrice, and the store itself began hosting community meetings and workshops aimed at fostering understanding and breaking down the barriers that divided them. It was a symbol of the change that was happening, and every step forward felt like a victory in its own right. Beatrice found herself being invited to speak at rallies and local events. She spoke about her experiences, about the importance of standing up for what's right, and the power of community. She wasn't an expert on social justice or law enforcement reform, but her words came from the heart. She spoke for those who felt overlooked and unheard, for those who had been unjustly treated and silenced. And as she spoke, she could see the effect it had on those listening. People were inspired, and they were moved to take action in their own lives. Beatrice had become a quiet leader, someone whose courage had sparked a fire in others. Meanwhile, Maya, who had recorded the video that started it all, continued to work alongside Beatrice and other community leaders. She had never thought of herself as someone who could make a difference, but now, seeing the changes unfolding around her, she realized how powerful one simple act could be. Maya's actions had sparked a movement, and it wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was a shift in the way people thought and acted. She had never anticipated the far-reaching consequences of her decision to record, but now, as she stood with Beatrice, she could see just how much of an impact it had made. Maya had been part of something that had changed the course of events, and she was proud of the role she played. As Beatrice continued to advocate for justice, the city began to take steps toward real change. The local police department, under the scrutiny of the public and the media, began to implement new policies focused on accountability and community relations. Training programs were introduced, and officers were taught to better understand the communities they served. It wasn't a perfect solution, and Beatrice knew that true change would take time, but it was a start. The wheels of reform had been set in motion, and the community had proven that their voices mattered. For Beatrice, the journey was far from over. She knew there was still much work to be done, but she also knew that the fight for justice and equality was a continuous one. The support she had received from her community, the activism that had blossomed from her experience, and the conversations that had started as a result of her ordeal made her believe that change was possible. It was a long road, but it was a road worth walking. She had seen how one moment of courage could transform a community, and now she was determined to continue speaking out for what was right. As Beatrice stood at the front of a crowded community event one evening, looking out at the faces of the people who had supported her every step of the way, she felt a deep sense of gratitude. She had come so far from that moment in the grocery store. What had started as an ordinary day had turned into a defining moment in her life, and in the lives of so many others. In the end, it wasn't just about the officers or the injustice she had faced. It was about the power of unity, the strength of a community, and the unwavering belief that, together, they could make a difference.